Now introducing Marvel After Dark. Hey folks, so some news broke that made me want to talk about something. So it has been revealed, this would have been a week and a bit ago, if I released this when I'm planning to, that the upcoming Kraven the Hunter movie is going to be rated R. And it just got me thinking in general about how is Marvel going to handle R-rated franchises. Now, it's worth acknowledging right now that while Kraven the Hunter is a Marvel property, it's not necessarily going to be MCU, or at least not any more than anything that is in theoretically its own pocket version of the multiverse like Venom, etc., because this is a Sony joint, and they are kind of doing their own thing with this. And the reason I kind of want to tackle it, though, is not just because of Sony doing its own thing, which they came close to doing before with Venom, I'll touch on that, but also because the indication has been that Marvel understands that when they do Deadpool 3, which we know they're working on, the expectation is for it to be rated R. And they've given every indication, I don't think they've said flat out 100%, but every indication has been they intend to honor that. I think they understand that if they try and release it as a PG-13, they're going to lose a lot of credibility, at least with that character specifically. So R-rated movies do seem to be in Marvel's future. And there's other characters that it could potentially apply to. We have a Blade movie coming up. The last Blade franchise was rated R. Doesn't necessarily mean that the upcoming one with Mahershala Ali has to be, but it's certainly on the table. And as I said, Sony did kind of try to lean this way before with Venom. There was actually word that they were intending to release it as an R-rated movie. The word was they were going to try and release rated R, but they backpedaled from that, and ultimately they didn't. Now, the exact nature of what went on behind the scenes, what Disney's demands were or weren't, we don't know. But at this point, unless we get a reversal, unless history repeats itself and we just get a reversal of, no, actually it won't be rated R, that Kraven the Hunter movie, unless that happens, then R-rated movies are going to be in Disney's future. I mean, with Deadpool, if nothing else. And it'll be interesting to see how that plays out for a couple of reasons. First is obviously Marvel is a family brand. That is what these films have been built to be, as family films. Mainstream, PG-13, big budget, bring the whole family films. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't been violent. They have been, but they've been violent in a very specific way that allows for a PG-13 rating. Which sort of begs the first question, would R-rated Marvel properties just be the same things already with just swearing and blood? I mean, that's what Deadpool will be, but that's what Deadpool's already been established to be. And if that's what Marvel R-rated films are, is that enough? Because the thing is, right now, the Marvel Cinematic Universe is at a crossroads that Marvel, the comic book publisher, was at some time ago. Because at a certain point, even in the wake of like the extreme nature of 90s comics, where things did get violent and brutal and everybody seemed weirdly okay with it for some freaking reason, but it still kept it in a fantastical realm that allowed it to get away with claiming to be largely all ages stuff. But then, in the wake of DC starting its Vertigo line, where it did some more adult things, Marvel started its Max line. Now, Marvel Max, I don't think is still going as an imprint, but it introduced a number of things and also migrated a number of existing characters into it. Jessica Jones was introduced as a Marvel Max property. The Punisher migrated over to Marvel Max. A number of other characters were attempted as Marvel Max properties and didn't do as well. They did something with Luke Cage that didn't quite work. They did something with Howard the Duck that really didn't work. But this is something that Marvel has dealt with before in its comic book format. The idea of giving it its own imprint to make it feel like this is something a little bit outside of our normal output. And the way they would tend to handle that continuity-wise was that select parts of the more family accessible Marvel Comics continuity would bleed over into the Max imprints. But for a while, at least initially, things that were done in Max tended to stay in Max. And I think that's going to be the main thing that we'll see moving forward with Disney as R-rated films start to be introduced into this Marvel continuity. Because a big part of the MCU, and arguably an increasing part with the way that stories are being started and or followed up on in the TV series and then migrating over to the movies or coming in from the movies, there's a lot more bleed over. There's a lot more interconnection now than there honestly really ever has been. But that interconnection would probably work against them if they tried to do it with the R-rated films. Because if you have something brought up or a plot point that is relevant to a PG-13 Avengers team-up movie that has its origins in and only makes the most sense if you have taken in an R-rated Punisher movie, for example, well, that's not going to rub a lot of families the right way, where younger members of the family are suddenly not going to fully know what's going on because they may not be allowed to watch some parts of it. In that way, that almost has more appeal to me than the fact of like going more adult and telling more adult stories or more violent stories or stories where they just say a lot. What interests me more is what will they do when there is a legitimate business-related reason to not overly connect it with the rest of the MCU? Because that is where I am starting to get Marvel fatigue a little bit. The interconnectedness, and I talked about this in a way when I did my video on continuity in general, but at a certain point, when the interconnectedness becomes so enmeshed, things stop feeling like properties in and of themselves, and they just feel like entries in a Wikipedia timeline or something. It just starts to feel like I'm just getting in one piece, but I have to take in everything to understand what's going on. And each individual piece becomes less and less satisfying as a piece of entertainment unto itself because it's pulling in too many things from other sources. So you can't fully enjoy it unless you've taken in those other stuff. And it'll leave so many dangling plot threads, or in some cases feel like it doesn't end properly at all. In which case you're like, okay, well, I have to go to this next thing to get resolution on that. The idea of fully encapsulating, of closing off, of having more standalone things is becoming a more and more distant thing at Marvel. But if properties, certain properties, appropriate properties, again, Punisher, Blade, Deadpool, obviously, if those are allowed to exist in an R-rated space, there would be a pretty good incentive to not overly connect them. And again, I think they could get away with certain nods of, the greater MCU in those films, but I wouldn't expect what happens in those films to bleed over into the mainstream MCU. And it'll be really interesting to see how this goes. Because, Deadpool they were always going to make because Deadpool is incredibly successful as an R-rated franchise. But R-rated franchises aren't much of a thing anymore. They used to be. They used to be massive, and not even necessarily horror franchises like, Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street, but things like Rambo, Terminator originally was an R-rated franchise. These more intensive action-oriented things, or even things with certain horror flavorings like the Alien franchise, the Predator franchise, these were all originally R-rated franchises, but pretty much all of them eventually ended up migrating over to PG-13, or at least trying to. Not Rambo, but pretty much the rest of them, because that's where the money is now. The thing is, money is ultimately the problem, because as these films get more expensive, as the actors get paid more, as the post-production work, special effects, how many special effects houses you have to hire to get the thing done in a timely manner, as all of that costs more, as production gets bigger, as marketing budgets get bigger, and they have to, because it's not just a matter of a dozen or so mainstream movies released anymore. It is now hundreds, and you also have to compete with streaming. Everything costs more. And when it costs more, you need to make more. And if you need to make more, it's bad for business to cut off the ability of a chunk of the potential audience to be able to see your movie at all. So that's why R-rated movies are pretty much at this point the domain of flat out horror films and adult dramas. You don't get too many big budgeted kind of films at an R rating anymore. You used to. Like, people genuinely forget that Terminator 2 was rated R. Maybe part of that has become, for some weird reason, it was also still marketed to kids. Like, there were toys and everything. But, like, that was an R-rated movie. It's just gotten to a point where R is not as economically viable. Now, we've had the R movie success stories, even within comic book space. Deadpool, I mentioned. Blade. Logan, specifically, as a one-off. But the thing is, part of why those have been successful is because they are uniquely tailored to what that was, to an R-rated audience. And honestly, Blade is old enough at this point that it feels odd to include it because enough of the landscape has changed since that trilogy came out. But certainly Logan and Deadpool, they were allowed to go some more adult places. But in the case of Deadpool, they had to take a much tighter budget for the kind of movie that it was than would be standard. And Logan probably wouldn't have happened at all if Deadpool hadn't proved the viability of an R-rated superhero property. Now, tonally, Logan and Deadpool are at opposite ends of the freaking spectrum, but it still proved the general viability of it. And the thing is, with certain characters, Marvel was going to have to open itself up to R ratings to be able to do them properly. Because a big part of Marvel's success, whatever you think about it at this point or have always thought about it, a big part of its success was feeling like it did properly honor these characters. And there are some characters that don't play right if you don't put them in an R-rated world. The Punisher, as I said, kind of a big one. And Jessica Jones, I would include in that. There are some characters you could go either way on. You know, you could do an R-rated version of that. You could do a PG-13 version of that. I would include characters like Ghost Rider and something like that. You could lean more into the horrific aspects, or you could do it like the Nick Cage movie did and just kind of go silly with it. But there are some that the audience, the fans, the people whose sort of stamp of approval is kind of core to a lot of what the MCU is, they're going to say, no, that's wrong. They're going to call foul with certain properties if you don't let them be R-rated. Now, exactly how much Marvel does or doesn't care about that, it's hard to tell. Obviously, Marvel's not afraid to make changes, and there are certain stripes of fandom they are happy to ignore. But it is kind of important that at least a chunk of the original fandom is going, yeah, that makes sense for those characters. Because as self-sustaining as the MCU is at this point, if they're going to continue to add in new stuff, the opinion of the original fans does matter, if only for the optics. Because if the people who love these characters are seeing what you're putting up on screen and going, that's wrong, it's not going to be impossible to sell at a general audience, but you're going to be doing it at a handicap. And you're better off avoiding that initial hit in the first place if you can. And for the most part, I think Marvel has been pretty good about doing that. Again, there's a certain stripe of fan that has been ticked off at them for a very long time, and that won't change, and they've learned to just ignore them, which is for the best. But when it feels like none of the fandom are thinking what you're doing is a good idea, that's when you have to be like, oh, wait a minute. Because the few times that has happened with Marvel, yeah, it's all stuff that we tend to forget. The Inhumans TV show comes to mind. The Iron Fist TV show, the Defenders TV show. Now, granted, those last two were Netflix specifically and less direct input from Marvel, but like when these things don't fully land and when the people who love these original characters are going, this ain't it, well, yeah, it's less incentive to try and keep that going. But even if you don't totally nail it, if the fans are on your side and going, yeah, we want to see more of this, there's a reason to keep going. And R-rated right now, if you handle it properly, if you use it to work with characters who belong in that space, then from that approach to not be offering R-rated movies, you're kind of leaving money on the table. It's only when you take something that would work absolutely perfectly well in a PG-13 and migrate it to R that you are losing money and losing audience share, because this appeals to everybody, but you're saying a whole chunk of the audience won't be allowed to see it without parental supervision. But there are some characters that is the space they should exist in. So as long as it is parsed properly, I think not only could R-rated films be a sizable part of Marvel's future, they could be a pretty lucrative part if they budget correctly and use the right characters. Now, again, this is Sony more than Marvel itself. Is Kraven the right character to do this with? I'm not so sure about that. I guess maybe if you're doing a solo movie, which they are, and you're not ever planning to integrate him in with Spider-Man, yeah, potentially. There's a way to do that, certainly. In my mind, it does mean you can't use the character in Spider-Man movies, though. If you are willing to accept that, and like Sony may or may not try, but if you're willing to accept that you are basically closing off the possibility of the character in a Spider-Man film proper, in order to give him his own thing, yeah, R-rated could work. Could give him more of his own identity. Could make it a more unique thing. Make it stand out more. That has potential. But it's going to have to be something that, well, Marvel has to approach delicately. Whether or not Sony's been approaching it delicately up to this point, it is hard to say. And of course, I'm sure there are some fans out there who will be asking me, well, what about DC? The Snyder Cut was effectively R-rated, and, you know, the director's cut of BVS. And, like, I don't really want to get into, well, any of that, to be honest, because at this point, the DCU is being completely reworked from the ground up. Now, there probably will be R-rated movies in there, but the thing is, the DCU being reworked at this point, I think the Suicide Squad was rated R. I think so. So James Gunn certainly doesn't have a problem with R-rated movies in that setting, but they're resetting their continuity. They're not in the position that Marvel is. They don't have a solid core basis of family audience that Marvel has been working to death for years now, for over a decade. DC doesn't have that, so if they want to build R-rated films into their structure from the offset, they've got a bit more freedom to do that. Marvel's got to be careful because they're going to be integrating it into an existing family franchise. And so, as I said, I think the best way to do it is to be very careful about the characters selected and to have the connections basically mostly go one way. Which, again, is largely how the Max line at Marvel was done. They weren't always picking the right characters, but the connections were largely one way. In that original run of Alias, which is where Jessica Jones came from, characters like Captain America did factor in. She didn't show up in Captain America stories, not at that point in time, at any rate. But they could show up there and show a more adult side of them. You'd have to be careful in a movie equivalent of that, of not putting your big family marquee stars in the marketing for the R-rated film, because then it's going to make it look appealing to an audience it's not intended for. So again, you got to balance that. But having the connections work in one direction and as little as possible in the other, probably be the safe bet. And Marvel seems to be favoring safe bets right now, for better or worse, as it were. Anyway, at seeing the headline about the Kraven movie just got my brain thinking about that. I wanted to share my thoughts. What do you think? Whatever your thoughts are on the possibility or the future of R-rated films under the MCU or in the Marvel umbrella, drop something down in the comments. Let's talk about it. Patreon pays the bills. It enables me to do this as my living. Any amount that you can help me out with is of great assistance, even if you can't. The usual YouTube stuff helps me out. You know what it is. You don't even need me to tell you. But what I really want you to remember is, you are beautiful. You are valid. And you are loved. You are the council. I'm just running the meetings. And until next time, this council is adjourned. My thanks to all my patrons, but in particular, I want to thank Robin Moore, Zubin Lutfula, Sarvis, Tarak, the thing that goes doink in the anime, Ruth, Oliver B., Solitary Pictures, Ulrich Bogdan, Melinda Walters, Imudelki, Leotha Boyd, Auntie Kate 808, Becky Sparks, Fernambulax the Poodle, Robin Powell, Tracy Scrabbit, Angry Casperl, Tim Price, Adam RDL Taylor, Goddess Alida, I'm not sure. David Hall, Shayla Gourlay, Rosalind Bennett. You want to hear me mess up your name too? It's in the Patreon perks. I gotta work on that.